Colin Powell versus Dick Cheney. The fight is on. Dick Cheney is releasing a new book where he basically says he got Colin Powell fired. He says that Colin Powell was not sufficiently deferential to the president. The president decided to go into Iraq, and Colin Powell should have just saluted and supported it 100%. Well, Colin Powell is going to fight back against Cheney on Face the Nation. Let's get started with clip 6.
This book that Dick Cheney himself said is going to cause heads all over Washington to explode. I guess I'd ask you, General, is your head exploding?
My head isn't exploding, and I haven't noticed any other heads exploding in Washington, D.C., and the explosive part of the book is what Mr. Cheney says is explosive, but what really sort of got my attention was this way in which he characterized it. It's going to cause heads to explode. That's quite a visual. And in fact, the kind of headline I would expect to come out of a gossip columnist, or the kind of headline you might see one of the supermarket tabloids write, it's not the kind of headline I would have expected to come from a former vice president of the United States of America.
Damn. All right, that's a nice little shot to Cheney, but he's just getting warmed up. Let's go to the next one.
Mr. Cheney has had a long and distinguished career, and I hope in his book that's what he will focus on, not these cheap shots that he's taking at me and other members of the administration who served to the best of our ability for President Bush.
So you just label them flatly cheap shots?
Well, yeah, they are cheap shots.
You know, there's a great irony here because Cheney, while he was in office, was, legendary for being against leaks, unless, of course, they helped him. He would leak, Valerie Plame identity in a second. But in terms of leaks coming from their side, he was mental about it, right? Leaks that might hurt them. Now he's out of office and he's leaking like a sieve. And he said, oh yeah, Powell was this and George Tenet was that and they all sucked and Condoleezza Rice came crying to me, talking to me about how right I was and how she apologized and I got this guy fired and I got that guy fired. And so Colin Powell, of course, calls it what it is. They're all cheap shots. What happened? I thought you didn't like leaks. It turns out you love leaks, right? Now, on to the issue of Iraq itself, this is what General Powell says.
He says that I went out of my way not to present my positions to the president, but to take them outside of the administration. That's nonsense. The president knows that I told him what I thought about every issue of the day. Mr. Cheney may forget that I'm the one who said to President Bush, if you break it, you own it. And you have got to understand that if we have to go to war in Iraq, we have to be prepared for the whole war, not just the first phase. And Mr. Cheney and many of his colleagues did not prepare for what happened after the fall of Baghdad. And I persuaded the president to take the case to the United Nations to see if it could be solved without war. And if it couldn't be solved without war, we would have people aligned with us. Mr. Cheney went out immediately after the president made that decision and undercut it by giving 2 speeches to 2 veterans groups that essentially said he didn't believe it would work. That's not the way you support a president.
Now, you got to understand something. What Colin Powell just said there is an absolute fact. If Dick Cheney didn't like something President Bush did, he'd immediately go and talk to the press about what a bad decision it was. So he had no compunction whatsoever about supporting the president and his decisions. If he didn't like the decision, he immediately tried to undercut it by saying, oh, we shouldn't have gone to the United Nations. It was a bad decision by the president. And for the vice president to do that is even more damaging. But then he turns around with no remorse, no conscience, and comes back and says, hey, you know what? Colin Powell didn't fully support our decision enough. Which, by the way, since he's the one that gave that speech at the UN, is a comical assertion. The great mark on Colin Powell's record, the travesty of his career, is how much he supported the Iraq war and that UN speech that he gave. And of course, Cheney put him up to it. If anything, Colin Powell got played by Cheney, and that he should apologize for. Speaking of apologies, even George Will, who's a deep conservative, obviously, thinks this Cheney book is a joke in that it has no regrets. Watch what he says.
George,
the one after.
You feel like this memoir has one glaring omission.
565 pages and a simple apology would have been in order in some of them, which is to say, the great fact of those 8 years was we went to war, big war, costly war, under false pretenses. And to write a memoir in which you say essentially nothing seriously went wrong, if I wrote a memoir of my last week, I would have things to apologize for.
Well, hey, I've got agreement with George Will on that one. But of course, in Dick Cheney's absolutist world, he's always right, 100% of the time, and everyone who disagrees with him is a traitor and needs to be called out and made fun of and ridiculed and smeared in his books. Look, that's what he does, man. That's what he did with Valerie Plame. All he ever does is leak and snipe at people in the press when they disagree with him. He's a terrible, hideous character.